I never thought I'd share this story, but I need to get it off my chest now. I discovered that my entire family knew about my fiancé's affair with my best friend, yet said nothing. The wedding was days away, and they were determined to keep me completely in the dark. I grew up as a people pleaser, always doing whatever I could to maintain fragile family harmony. I never imagined my parents and siblings would withhold something this devastating, especially before my rehearsal dinner. Brad, my fiancé, was the man I believed I'd grow old with, loyal to a fault. He came across as gentle, patient, and supportive, so it really felt impossible that he'd ever cheat. Kara, my best friend, was practically a sister to me, someone I always trusted with everything. I still can't wrap my head around how she justified sleeping with the man I loved. Unreal. I first heard whispers of their affair from an old acquaintance who showed up in town. He claimed he saw Brad and Kara acting too familiar at a bar, thinking they were unnoticed. Initially, I dismissed it, convinced Brad and Kara would never ever betray me like that. But that night, doubt clung to me, and I started scrutinizing interaction between my fiancé and her. They exchanged glances that seemed loaded, but I talked myself out of confronting them, terrified of conflict. I confided in my sister, hoping she'd tell me I was imagining things, but she froze. Her silence was my first real clue that something bigger was quietly happening behind my back. I confronted my dad, thinking he'd reassure me, but he dodged the subject and insisted I relax. That was so unlike him. He usually pried into every aspect of my life, no exceptions. I felt sick. I decided to investigate, so I checked Brad's phone when he left it charging in the kitchen. He'd always been protective of his privacy, but I had a nagging feeling something sinister was there. Sure enough, I found messages from Kara, though they were mostly very mundane at first glance. I scrolled deeper and discovered coded language, references to meeting up, and a hidden folder of photos. That was my confirmation. Explicit pictures of them together, time-stamped nights I thought he was working. I couldn't breathe. I forced myself to stay calm and took screenshots, sending them to my phone. I hid my rage because I needed a plan, especially knowing my family had hidden this. I suspected they thought I'd never find out, that I'd go through with the wedding ignorant. Cruelty of it stunned me, but I was ready to exact my revenge at the rehearsal dinner. Perfect. In the days leading up to the rehearsal dinner, I pretended absolutely everything was normal. Brad still texted Kara on the sly, thinking I was clueless, while my family kept acting oblivious. I had to play the doe-eyed fiancé, busy with floral arrangements and seating charts, while seething inside. Every time my mom asked if I was stressed, I forced a smile, wanting to scream the truth. This charade felt suffocating, but it was necessary if I wanted to execute the perfect takedown. I started collecting evidence, including screenshots, phone logs, and even times they snuck off together. My intention was to confront them, ensuring no one could spin the narrative in their favor. The worst part was acting normal around Kara, who kept texting me about dresses and bachelorette plans. I'd respond politely, knowing full well she'd probably just been rolling around in my fiancé's bed. It was torture. I confided in no one. My siblings had already proven their loyalty lay elsewhere, and my father was no help either. He kept insisting I relax, like this was all some minor glitch. My older brother, who usually meddles in my life, pretended to be too busy with work. The conspiracy felt suffocating. I decided not to risk confronting any of them privately. I wanted the maximum impact when I finally revealed everything. Meanwhile, Brad kept telling me how excited he was for our wedding. Every time he kissed me or called me babe, I had to swallow the bile rising in my throat. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I barely slept. I kept replaying how I'd expose them all. I planned to humiliate Brad first, then Kara. Finally, I'd confront my family for their betrayal. Forgiveness was never an option. They would all pay. The rehearsal dinner was held at a nice banquet hall. Everyone dressed up, smiling as though we were on the verge of a joyous celebration. My mother fussed over decorations, my father greeted guests, and my siblings flitted around, pretending nothing was amiss. Brad was all charm, shaking hands and making small talk. Kara arrived fashionably late, wearing a dress that was way too white for someone who wasn't the bride. Seeing them together made my blood boil. My mother pulled me aside at one point, whispering that I looked pale and needed to eat something. She didn't realize my adrenaline was off the charts. I just nodded and excused myself. I watched as Brad and Kara exchanged a smug smile in a corner, thinking nobody saw. Little did they know the entire evening was my stage, and they were about to be the unwitting actors in my show. Just before dinner was served, I signaled the banquet staff to help me set up a projector. Everyone looked curious. Usually, slideshows at rehearsal dinners are sweet collages of the couple's history, but I had other plans. Brad approached, asking if I needed help. I told him to sit tight, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Once everyone was seated, I stood up and thanked them for coming. I saw my sister's face go pale, realizing I might be about to drop a bomb. I clicked to the first slide, a photo of Brad and me beaming with happiness. A collective awe filled the room. Then I progressed to random pictures of us through the years. Everyone relaxed, thinking it was a typical presentation. That's when I unveiled the screenshots, text exchanges, and incriminating images of Brad and Kara. The entire room went dead silent. Brad leapt up, stammering, "It's not what it looks like!" Kara gasped, her face contorting in horror. My family exchanged panicked glances, fully aware they'd been complicit. I kept my voice steady as I explained how I'd learned of their affair and how each member of my family had known but said nothing. My mother tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I let the screenshots scroll, each one more damning than the last. Brad tried to yank the projector's cord out of the socket, but the staff swiftly intervened at my prior request. People around us stared, some in shock, some in morbid fascination. This was no typical rehearsal dinner speech. I turned to Kara and said, "You were my best friend. Thanks for proving loyalty means nothing to you." She burst into tears, but I felt not the slightest twinge of pity. I then asked Brad if he had anything to say for himself. He babbled about being drunk, stressed, and how it just happened. My father stood up, telling me to calm down, which made me snap. I told him to sit, that he'd lost the right to mediate anything. I demanded he explain why he kept this from me. He looked at my mother uneasily. She looked torn, and then came her bombshell. My mother spoke up, voice shaking. "I didn't want this wedding to go on because your father's been having an affair too." The room erupted in a collective gasp. My father's eyes bulged. She revealed that for years, my father had been involved with none other than Brad's mother. I nearly dropped the microphone. Brad's betrayal already stung, but learning my father and his mother had their own twisted history took this to another level. Chaos exploded. Brad stared at me, then at his mother, who was conveniently absent from the rehearsal dinner. My father tried to deny it, but my mother produced receipts, hotel bills, and cryptic emails. So while they were condemning me to a life with a cheater, my father had been living a double life. Everything started making sense. The hush-hush behavior, the reason my mother seemed so distant lately. I realized she'd discovered his affair and had chosen to let me marry Brad anyway, maybe out of spite or confusion. The entire room was ablaze with chatter. Brad sank into his chair, color drained from his face. My siblings looked mortified, but they didn't rush to my side. They just stood there. I felt an overwhelming surge of anger and triumph. None of them had my back, so I had no reason to hold back either. I took a long breath and spelled it out. The wedding was off. I declared it in front of everyone, making it official. Brad's face twisted in panic, and he tried to grab my hand, begging me to reconsider. I snatched it away, glowering at him. "You're a liar, a cheater, and you deserve nothing from me." Then I announced I'd be sending everyone a link to a folder of proof, just so no one could claim ignorance later. People stared as I walked around the head table to Kara. I told her I hoped she and Brad would be miserable together. She sobbed, but I had no sympathy. My mother kept her gaze on the floor. I turned to her, voice trembling with anger, and told her she should have told me the truth long ago. The betrayal cut deep, and I was done shielding anyone. Then I looked at my siblings. I demanded to know why they stood by and watched me plan a wedding with a man they knew was cheating. My older brother mumbled something about not wanting to break my heart. My sister said she was pressured by our parents to keep it quiet, hoping Brad would fix his mistakes. I felt a hollow laugh escape my lips. They'd let me buy a wedding dress, send out invitations, and book a venue, all while coddling the cheaters. The guests looked on, stunned, some visibly uncomfortable, others appalled. Nobody had seen a meltdown quite like this. I told my siblings I couldn't trust them anymore. If this was how they handled loyalty, I had no use for them. I saw tears in their eyes, but it did nothing to change my resolve. Their choices led to this. Suddenly, my mother stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. She insisted she only stayed silent because she hoped I'd discover it on my own and break off the engagement without a public scandal. She admitted she'd wrestled with telling me, but feared my father's reaction, given his own affair. He had threatened divorce and financial ruin if she spoke up about his secrets. It was all too tangled. My father tried again to spin the story, but I cut him off. I wasn't interested in hearing excuses. If they'd loved me, they would have protected me. Instead, they chose appearances over my well-being. I saw the guilt etched across my mother's face, but I was beyond caring. I turned to my father and told him he had no place in my life anymore. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. Determined to have the last word, I picked up the microphone once more. I told everyone present that there would be no wedding, no reconciliation, and no forgiveness. Brad tried to speak, but I raised my hand. This was my moment. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You two deserve each other. Congratulations on your happily never after." Then I pivoted and addressed my family directly. "You all knew. Every single one of you stood by while I planned the biggest day of my life. I hope you realize I owe you nothing now." A hush fell over the room. The weight of my words settled on them like a cold verdict. I handed the microphone to the speechless wedding planner, grabbed my purse, and calmly walked out. In that moment, I felt a twisted sense of liberation I'd never known before. I went straight to a hotel that night, ignoring the barrage of calls and texts. Brad left voicemails sobbing, claiming he was drunk or stressed, but his excuses meant nothing. Kara texted repeatedly, begging for my forgiveness. She insisted it was a mistake that spiraled out of control. I blocked them both. My father tried calling, but I rejected every attempt. My mother showed up at the hotel lobby, but I told the front desk to turn her away. My siblings sent long messages, claiming they never wanted to hurt me. I couldn't bring myself to respond. None of them deserved my attention. I drained a minibar bottle of champagne alone in that room, oddly grateful that I discovered the truth before signing those marriage papers. The bitterness was overwhelming, but so was the relief. I was finally free to move forward, unburdened by their lies. Of course, the fallout was massive. Vendors called non-stop, confused by the sudden cancellation. Extended family members reached out, demanding to know what happened. Gossip spread like wildfire in our social circles. My mother told me she was preparing to divorce my father, who had fled to his mistress's place for damage control. I heard through the grapevine that Kara lost her job after failing to show up for a week, presumably too embarrassed to face anyone. Brad was living with a friend, apparently in dire straits, since I canceled our apartment lease. Legally, I lost some money on the wedding deposits, but I considered it the cost of my freedom. People asked if I felt guilty for exposing them in such a dramatic fashion. Honestly, I felt no remorse. They had conspired to destroy me in private, so I saw no issue with my very public revenge. In the weeks that followed, I took time off work to sort my life out. I sought therapy to handle the betrayal and anger churning inside me. The therapist asked if I ever wanted to mend fences with my family. My answer was immediate. Not now, maybe never. They had known about Brad's affair and said nothing. They had watched me plan a wedding with a man who was sleeping with my best friend. That sort of treachery isn't something I can forgive. Maybe time changes things, but as of now, all I feel is righteous fury. My mother called daily, leaving tearful voicemails, but I let them pile up. My father tried to blame everything on my mother, and my siblings tried to remain neutral, but there was no neutral ground left. I told them all I needed space, and that was final. Eventually, word got around that Kara moved away. Good riddance. Brad tried to salvage his reputation, claiming I'd overreacted. He never mentioned the explicit photos, conveniently. I had a few acquaintances approach me, asking if I regretted humiliating him so openly. My answer was simple: absolutely not. He disrespected me behind my back for months. I had every right to reveal the truth. My bank account took a hit when I returned the wedding gifts, but I kept the ring for a while, debating whether to pawn it. In the end, I mailed it back to his address, along with copies of the photos he'd so desperately hidden. Petty? Maybe, but I wanted to make sure he understood I was done playing nice. My best friend betrayed me, my fiancé cheated, and my family lied. I owed no one my kindness. I found a new job in a different city. It felt like the perfect chance to start over. On moving day, my mother showed up unexpectedly, tears in her eyes. She apologized for everything, admitting that she'd been weak and had let my father's manipulations dictate her silence. Part of me pitied her, but I couldn't bring myself to let her back into my heart just yet. I told her I appreciated her apology, but needed to go live my life on my terms. She begged for a chance to fix things, but I was numb. I asked her to leave before I broke down in front of her. Maybe someday I'll revisit the ashes of my relationships with my family, but not now. They all crossed a line that stole my sense of security. My trust in them is gone, replaced by a cold resolve. So here I am, in my new apartment, sharing this story with anyone who cares to read it. I'm not looking for sympathy, and I'm not searching for closure through reconciliation. I got my closure when I stood up in that banquet hall and exposed them all. My life is far from perfect now, but at least it's mine to rebuild. I'm taking it day by day, learning to trust myself again. If there's one lesson I learned, it's that betrayal deserves consequences, not forgiveness. Let them live with the aftermath of their choices. I'll live with mine. There's a certain peace in knowing I refuse to be anyone's fool. I don't know what the future holds for my family or if I'll ever speak to them again, but I do know I'm finally free, and that freedom is the sweetest revenge of all.